You've heard it said that in this church you can believe anything you want. But that is absolutely not true. If you heard it from somebody outside of this church, I hope you'll correct them. And if you heard it from somebody inside of this church, I hope you'll tell them to take another one of our Roots classes. Just believing anything or everything you want can be a road to great foolishness, harm, and regret. Here at All Souls, we say, let your conscience be your guide. Listening to your conscience is very different from believing anything that you want. It's about trusting and following that still small voice inside of you. Some of us call that inner voice the voice of God or the Spirit. Others call it the voice of truth, while some think of it as intuition and others as the dictates of reason. I'm not going to spend time today debating the nature of the conscience and where it comes from. But I want to discuss how we can listen to our conscience to create guardrails that keep our lives on track, that keep us on a healthy path, so that regret and temptation don't steal our future. I got the inspiration for this sermon this summer while I was in Amsterdam in Holland. I was there for a ministers' conference. It's a beautiful place, and there are canals that wind throughout the city. Now, people live on these canals in fabulous houseboats with flowers and plants up on the decks. The canals are used to transport goods, and instead of a bus or a subway for a few euros, you can hop on a canal boat to travel across the city. It's a very special place. Now, while there, I learned that back in the 1960s, the city erected guardrails around the edges of the canals because cars were constantly falling into the water. A very expensive undertaking for everybody involved. But even with these guardrails in place, to this day, an average of one car a week still takes the plunge. The purpose of all guardrails, right, are to warn you, to stop you before you meet danger or peril. That's why we see them on roads that run along high cliffs, along the edges of bridges, between ongoing traffic on the highways. They give us a warning, a last chance to avoid a serious problem. Well, it occurred to me that it would be nice to have some guardrails in our lives to help warn us or stop us prior to doing something that we would regret for a long time. Something that could steal our future from us. Something that might cause us to lose our health or our reputation or our marriage or our business. Something that might be irreversible or irredeemable. Now remember, I was thinking all this while I was in Amsterdam, where you can buy drugs and sex as easily and as legally as we buy a cup of Starbucks coffee here in the United States. It's true. They literally have coffee shops all over the city where on the menu you can purchase, along with lattes and cappuccinos, various kinds of hashish and marijuana from around the world. You can smoke it right there, or you can get it at the to-go window and take it with you onto the streets, into your car, on your bicycle, into the park. Here in the States, we're familiar with getting a wine menu when you go into a restaurant. It's very much like that in Amsterdam with drugs. And sex is just as easy to purchase, if not easier. In a very prominent part of the city, women with very skimpy clothing stand inside glass doorways, winking and cajoling and inviting in anyone who passes. Now, by officially permitting prostitution and drugs, Amsterdam has taken down the legal guardrails that are used in most countries to stop or restrain people from these behaviors. Without the barrier of law, people there have to develop other reasons besides government prohibition or risk of arrest to keep them from partaking. Now, being around all this made me consider, what are my reasons not to take part? Right? If it's legal, when in Rome, I'm far away from everyone and anyone who knows me, what's to stop me? Well, thinking about all that was the inspiration for this sermon this morning. When I got back to the States, I remembered that I'd seen a non-denominational megachurch minister from Atlanta who had done a 6-week series on the theme of guardrails. Now, his metaphor is the same as mine. However, his theology and many of his conclusions are quite different from mine. However, I did find some agreement in some areas. His name is Andy Stanley, and in his sermon, he explains how our culture baits us to indulge in certain behaviors, and then it chastises us when we do them. He's right. When you think about it, our culture tempts us and sells us on many things that are unhealthy or addictive. In one of his sermons, he asks, when was the last time you watched a movie where 2 married people had sex? Think about that. We don't want to watch married people have sex. It's kind of like watching your parents. Right? In other words, we entertain ourselves with adultery on TV, in the movies, in our books. Just living in our society, we are continually goaded and enticed to make bad decisions through consuming and spending, even going deep into debt. It's as if instead of guardrails, our culture puts up a sign in front of a canal that says, "Keep driving, come on." And then when we fall in the water, it turns around and calls us a loser. It's the opposite of a guardrail. It's misleading. That's why so many people in our culture end up addicted, greatly in debt, or having affairs. Billboards, movies, magazines, and commercials encourage us. But when we follow through on these selfish or materialistic values into our own ruin, then we become the source of ridicule. It's a classic bait and switch, and people fall for it all the time. On the plane home, my wife Anitra and I, we saw a girl who must have been 16, and she was wearing a pair of shorts so minuscule that I looked over at Anitra and I said that those shorts look like they'd be too small to fit onto our 19-month-old daughter. This teenager might as well have been on the plane in a bikini. And one of the things our culture does is it sexualizes our girls at a young age, and then, of course, it chastises them if they get pregnant or become promiscuous. And that's why parents have to create guardrails at home. Otherwise, our children are at the whims of a culture that baits us and then disparages us for taking the bait. Yet it seems that people who catch on to what's happening either overreact or underreact. The more puritanical and more traditionally religious people tend to erect brick walls rather than guardrails. They often prefer total prohibition. Campaigns like Just Say No or abstinence-only approaches. Some churches outlaw all dancing or any drinking of alcohol, even for adults. In some religions, women are made to cover their heads or their bodies and sometimes their entire faces. It is said to be done in order to protect men from their desires and their temptations. Now, using the analogies of the canals in Amsterdam, that's like saying, because there's a danger and some people will be careless and susceptible, that we're going to erect brick walls along all of the canals so that no one can possibly fall in. But this approach is an overreaction. And what we find with these all-or-nothing approaches to morality, more often than not, is they end up creating hypocrisy and guilt and judgment and inauthentic people.